Why do you keep avoiding me? Emily Carter finally asked across the low wooden fence that separated their yards, her voice calm, but carrying just enough curiosity to stop a man in his tracks. Marcus Bennett froze halfway up the narrow path that led from his driveway to the back door of his small two-story house. The late afternoon sun hung low over the quiet North Carolina neighborhood, casting long golden shadows across trimmed lawns and parked pickup trucks. For a moment, he didn't move. In one hand, he held a worn canvas tool bag dusted with drywall powder from a long shift at the construction site. His shoulders were broad, his posture steady, the posture of a man used to lifting heavy things and carrying responsibilities that didn't show on the outside. But something in that simple question tightened the air around him. Slowly, he turned his head just enough to glance toward the fence. Emily stood on the other side beside a row of newly planted hydrangeas, a garden hose coiled loosely at her feet. She had moved into the house next door only 3 weeks ago, yet somehow she had already become impossible for Marcus to ignore. Not because she was loud or intrusive. In fact, she was the opposite. Friendly, patient, the kind of neighbor who waved every morning and offered a polite smile whenever their paths nearly crossed. Yet every time she stepped outside, Marcus found a reason to leave. Every time she spoke, he answered with the shortest words possible, and every time their eyes almost met, he looked away like someone staring too long at the sun. Emily had noticed. Anyone would have. Her brow furrowed slightly as she waited for his answer, one hand resting lightly on the fence rail. A warm breeze drifted through the maple trees lining the street, rustling the leaves with a soft whisper. Somewhere down the block, a basketball bounced rhythmically on a driveway. Inside Marcus's house, a cartoon played faintly through an open kitchen window where his 7-year-old daughter Lily was finishing her after-school snack. The neighborhood was peaceful, ordinary, the kind of place where conversations over fences usually revolved around weather forecasts or weekend barbecues. But Marcus's chest felt tight, as if the space between those fence boards held something heavier than a simple question. He shifted his weight, eyes lowering to the grass for a second before finally answering. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. Because looking at you hurts. The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. Emily blinked, caught off guard not by anger, but by the unexpected honesty in his tone. Marcus didn't sound defensive. He sounded tired. The kind of tired that settles deep behind a person's eyes after years of carrying memories that refuse to fade. Emily studied his face more closely now. For the first time since moving in, she noticed the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the guarded expression of someone who had learned long ago that distance was safer than explanations. Marcus adjusted his grip on the tool bag and stepped toward his back door, clearly intending to end the conversation there. But before he could reach the porch steps, Lily's small voice called from the kitchen window. "Dad, the spaghetti's boiling over." Marcus paused again, exhaling slowly as if the simple chaos of dinner offered him a brief escape. He glanced once more toward the fence, where Emily still stood quietly processing what he had said. Neither of them spoke again for several seconds. The breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of fresh soil and cut grass, while the evening sun dipped a little lower behind the rooftops. And in that quiet suburban moment, something invisible had shifted between the two neighbors, something neither of them fully understood yet, but something that was only beginning. Marcus Bennett stood in the small kitchen gripping the wooden spoon as the pot of spaghetti bubbled on the stove, steam rising toward the humming ceiling fan, while Lily sat at the round table swinging her feet above the floor and coloring in a workbook from school. The house was modest but clean, the kind of place where every object had been chosen for usefulness rather than style. A second-hand refrigerator hummed softly beside the counter, a stack of unpaid mail rested near the toaster, and a faded calendar from the local hardware store hung on the wall beside a photograph of Lily taken during her kindergarten graduation. Marcus stirred the pot slowly, his mind still lingering on the quiet moment at the fence. "Because looking at you hurts." He had not planned to say that. In fact, he had spent the last 3 weeks doing everything possible to avoid any real conversation with the woman who had moved into the blue house next door. Yet the truth had slipped out before he could stop it. Lily looked up from her coloring page and tilted her head. "Dad, are you thinking about work again?" she asked. Marcus forced a small smile and shook his head gently. "No, sweetheart. Just making sure dinner does not burn. The little girl nodded with complete seriousness, as if boiling spaghetti required the same focus as building a skyscraper. Outside the kitchen window, the sun had lowered behind the tall maple trees lining the street, and the evening light filtered through the glass in soft amber streaks that warmed the worn countertops. Marcus lifted the pot lid for a moment, and the smell of tomato sauce filled the room, familiar and comforting. For years their evenings had followed the same rhythm. Marcus came home around 5:30 after a 10-hour shift at the construction site across town. He washed his hands, helped Lily with homework, and cooked dinner while the small television played quietly in the background. It was not a glamorous life, but it was steady. And for Marcus, steady meant safe. Lily hummed softly while coloring the sky purple above a cartoon house with crooked windows. "Miss Emily waved to me today when the school bus stopped," she said suddenly, her voice bright with excitement. Marcus paused with the spoon in his hand. "Did she?" he replied carefully. "Yes. She asked if I liked drawing, and she said her mom used to paint pictures when she was little." Lily held up the page proudly. "She said this looks really good." Marcus glanced at the drawing and nodded slowly. The picture was simple, the lines uneven, but Lily's happiness made it feel important. "It is good," he said quietly. For a moment he stared out the kitchen window, toward the fence that separated the 2 yards. From this angle, he could see the top of Emily's porch light and the corner of her garden where the hydrangeas swayed gently in the breeze. Everything about the scene looked peaceful. A normal neighborhood. A normal neighbor. Yet Marcus felt the same tight pressure in his chest that had followed him since the day the moving truck arrived next door. Sometimes the past did not stay where it belonged. Sometimes it walked right up to the fence and smiled politely like nothing had ever happened. The spaghetti water finally began to bubble over the rim of the pot, and Marcus lowered the heat quickly, focusing on the simple task in front of him. Lily continued coloring, completely unaware of the quiet storm of memories moving behind her father's steady expression. Outside, somewhere beyond the maple trees, a car passed slowly along the street, and the sound faded into the calm evening air, while Marcus Bennett stood in his small kitchen, wondering how long a man could keep running from a face that looked so painfully familiar. The next morning arrived with the soft gray light of early autumn filtering through thin clouds above Maplewood Street, and Marcus Bennett was already awake before the alarm clock beside his bed reached 6 o'clock. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of sparrows outside the kitchen window. Marcus moved through the small hallway with the careful steps of someone used to early mornings, pausing briefly at Lily's bedroom door, where a faint nightlight glowed beneath a poster of cartoon astronauts. Inside, Lily slept curled beneath a blanket decorated with tiny stars, one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit she had carried since she was 4 years old. Marcus watched her for a moment before quietly closing the door halfway and continuing toward the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and leaned against the counter while the coffee maker dripped the last warm drops into the glass pot. Outside, the neighborhood was slowly waking up. A garbage truck rumbled somewhere 2 blocks away, and the sky held the pale blue color that only appears just before sunrise fully settles in. Marcus stepped toward the sink and glanced out the window toward the neighboring yard. Emily Carter's porch light was still on, glowing softly against the early morning fog that drifted low across the grass. Her house looked neat and freshly painted, the pale blue siding still bright compared to the older homes along the street. A silver sedan sat in her driveway, and the small garden along the fence line looked recently watered. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee and looked away quickly, the same instinct returning like muscle memory. It had been easier before she arrived, before that moving truck had backed into the driveway 3 weeks earlier, while Marcus watched from his porch with Lily standing beside him, holding a popsicle that melted down her fingers in the summer heat. He still remembered the moment Emily stepped out of the passenger side door of the truck. She had pushed her sunglasses onto the top of her head and laughed at something the driver said, while lifting a small cardboard box from the seat. Marcus had only looked for 2 seconds. That was all it took. The resemblance had struck him like cold air rushing into a warm room. The same light brown hair falling past the shoulders. The same calm eyes that seemed to study everything quietly. Even the same habit of tilting her head slightly when she listened. Marcus had turned away immediately that day, pretending to check his phone while Lily waved cheerfully toward the new neighbor. Since then he had measured his routine carefully. Leave for work 5 minutes earlier. Come home through the side gate instead of the driveway. Keep conversations short. Avoid eye contact. Yet the face next door kept appearing at the edge of his life in small, unavoidable ways. Away from the porch. A polite hello near the mailbox. Lily mentioning that Miss Emily asked how her school day went. Marcus set his empty mug in the sink and rubbed his palm across his jaw slowly. The morning air drifting through the open window felt cool against his skin. Outside, the porch light next door clicked off with a quiet snap. A second later the front door opened, and Emily stepped onto the wooden steps holding a travel mug. She wore a gray sweater and dark jeans, her hair loosely tied back as she locked the door behind her. Marcus instinctively stepped back from the window, even though she had not looked in his direction. He knew this routine already. She would walk to her car around 6:15 every morning and drive toward the highway that led to downtown Raleigh, where her law firm office tower stood nearly 20 miles away. Lily's bedroom door creaked softly behind him as small footsteps padded into the kitchen. "Good morning, Dad," Lily said sleepily, rubbing one eye. Marcus turned toward her with a gentle smile that hid the tension still resting quietly in his chest. "Good morning, sweetheart," he replied, reaching for the cereal box. On the counter while outside the engine of Emily's car started, and the sound rolled slowly down the quiet suburban street. By 7:15 the morning traffic had begun to roll steadily along the two-lane road at the end of Maplewood Street, and Marcus Bennett's pickup truck joined the slow line of vehicles heading toward the construction site 15 miles away on the edge of Raleigh. The sky had cleared into a soft blue that promised a warm afternoon, and sunlight reflected off the windshields ahead like scattered flashes of silver. Marcus drove with one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other draped across the window frame, his thoughts moving quietly beneath the steady rhythm of the engine. At home, Lily would already be settling into her classroom, her small backpack tucked beside a wooden desk where she spent most mornings drawing animals in the margins of her math worksheets. The routine was familiar and predictable, something Marcus had worked hard to build over the past few years. Stability had become the one thing he protected more carefully than anything else. The construction site came into view shortly before 8 o'clock, a wide stretch of red clay surrounded by temporary fencing where the skeleton of a new office complex was rising floor by floor. Steel beams climbed toward the sky while cranes rotated slowly overhead like mechanical giants surveying the ground. Marcus parked his truck beside a row of dusty work vehicles and stepped out into the morning air that already carried the smell of sawdust and wet concrete. The workday began quickly as crews gathered near the tool shed, voices overlapping while the foreman reviewed safety instructions and the schedule for the day. Marcus listened quietly while pulling on a pair of worn work gloves, his movements calm and efficient. Most of the men on the crew had known him for years. They respected the way he worked, steady and dependable, never late and rarely distracted. When the foreman finished speaking, the group scattered across the site and the sound of power tools soon filled the air. Marcus spent the morning installing wooden framing along the second-floor interior walls, measuring boards carefully before securing them into place. The repetitive rhythm of hammering and drilling usually helped clear his mind, but today his thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet street where his house stood beneath the maple trees. Around noon the crew gathered near a stack of lumber for lunch, sitting on overturned buckets and toolboxes while eating sandwiches wrapped in foil. Marcus leaned against a beam and opened the lunch container Lily had helped pack that morning. A simple peanut butter sandwich and a small apple placed neatly beside a folded napkin. One of the workers glanced at him with a grin. "Your kid packed that again?" the man asked. Marcus nodded with a faint smile. "She insists," he replied. The conversation shifted to weekend plans and football scores, but Marcus remained mostly quiet, watching a line of clouds drift slowly across the sky above the steel framework. For a moment his thoughts returned to the fence behind his house and the woman who stood there yesterday evening asking a question that should have been simple to answer. He had spent years learning how to keep certain memories sealed away like tools locked inside a box at the back of the garage. Yet something about Emily Carter's presence next door had opened that box without warning. It was not her voice or her actions that unsettled him. It was the face, the same shape of the eyes, the same calm expression that once convinced him he was safe. Marcus finished his sandwich and brushed the crumbs from his hands before standing again. The afternoon work whistle sounded across the construction yard, echoing through the steel beams, while workers returned to their stations. Marcus lifted his tool belt back onto his waist and walked toward the unfinished corridor where the next section of framing waited. The sound of drills and hammers rose again around him, while sunlight streamed through the open structure. And somewhere far beyond the busy construction site, a quiet suburban street waited beneath the shade of maple trees where the past had unexpectedly moved in next door. The late afternoon sun leaned low over the unfinished office complex as the final whistle echoed across the construction site, and Marcus Bennett wiped the dust from his hands before climbing down from the wooden scaffold where he had spent the last hour fastening beams into place. The long workday had left a dull ache in his shoulders, but the familiar fatigue was something he welcomed because it usually meant sleep would come easily later that night. Around him, the other workers gathered their tools and traded brief conversations about traffic and dinner plans while pickup trucks began pulling out of the gravel lot one by one. Marcus removed his work gloves, folded them carefully, and placed them inside his tool bag before heading toward his truck. The drive back to Maplewood Street took just under 30 minutes when traffic moved smoothly, and today the road stretched ahead in long golden lines beneath a quiet evening sky. When Marcus finally turned onto his neighborhood street, the maple trees cast long shadows across the pavement, and the soft light of sunset gave the houses a warm amber glow that made everything look calmer than it felt. He parked his truck in the driveway and stepped out slowly, taking in the familiar view of his small yard where Lily's bicycle leaned against the porch railing. The front door opened before he even reached the steps. Lily burst outside with the excited energy that only children seem to have after a full day at school. "Dad, guess what happened today?" she said, almost tripping over her own words. Marcus smiled and lifted her briefly into the air before setting her back down. "Let me guess," he said gently. "You drew another masterpiece." Lily laughed and shook her head quickly. "No, something better. Miss Emily helped me with my math homework." The words settled in the air for a second longer than Marcus expected. His hand rested quietly on the porch rail while he processed what she had said. "She did?" he asked carefully. Lily nodded with enthusiasm and pointed toward the yard next door. "Yes, she was watering the flowers, and she saw me sitting on the steps trying to figure out fractions. She showed me an easier way, and then she said if I ever need help I can ask her." Marcus looked toward the fence line where the hydrangea bushes swayed gently in the evening breeze. A few seconds later, the back door of Emily Carter's house opened, and she stepped outside carrying a small watering can. She moved slowly along the garden bed, pouring water at the base of each plant while the setting sun lit the edges of her hair like soft copper. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest the moment his eyes landed on her face. Even from a distance, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. Lily tugged lightly on his sleeve. "Dad, can she come over for dinner sometime?" she asked with hopeful innocence. Marcus looked down at his daughter and then back toward the neighboring yard where Emily had just noticed them standing on the porch. She offered a small polite wave across the fence, the same friendly gesture she had given every evening since moving in. Marcus hesitated for a brief moment before lifting his hand slightly in return. It was the smallest wave imaginable, almost uncertain, but it was the first time he had not immediately looked away. Emily seemed surprised for a second, though her expression softened quickly into a warm smile before she returned to watering the last row of flowers. Marcus watched quietly as the sky above Maplewood Street shifted into deeper shades of orange and violet. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and a car rolled slowly past the end of the block. The neighborhood looked peaceful as evening settled in, yet Marcus knew something had begun to change in ways he had not expected. For weeks he had carefully kept his distance, believing that silence was the safest way to protect the quiet life he had built for Lily. But standing there now on the porch while his daughter talked excitedly about fractions and flowers, Marcus realized that the past was no longer waiting politely behind closed doors. It had already stepped across the fence and into the rhythm of their everyday lives. Later that evening, the quiet neighborhood settled into the calm rhythm that always followed sunset, and the soft glow of porch lights began appearing one by one along Maplewood Street. Inside the small Bennett house, the kitchen carried the warm scent of garlic bread and tomato sauce, While Lily sat at the round table finishing the last bites of dinner, her math workbook spread open beside her plate. Marcus rinsed the dishes slowly in the sink, the sound of running water blending with the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of crickets outside the window. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful, the kind of simple evening routine that had become the center of Marcus's life. Lily tapped her pencil against the table and squinted at the numbers in her workbook. "Dad, what is 8 divided by 2 again?" she asked. Marcus dried his hands on a kitchen towel and stepped over to the table. Glancing at the page, "That one is easy," he said gently. 8 divided by 2 is 4. Lily nodded slowly, writing the answer carefully before looking up with a small grin. "Miss Emily explained it like that too," she said. Marcus paused just long enough for the moment to settle quietly between them. Outside the kitchen window, the night air carried the faint scent of freshly watered soil from the neighboring yard. Marcus returned to the sink and placed the last dish in the rack while Lily gathered her pencils and colored markers into a small plastic case. A few minutes later, the back door creaked open as Marcus stepped onto the porch to breathe in the cooler evening air. The sky above the neighborhood had turned deep blue, and a few early stars flickered faintly between the branches of the tall maple trees that lined the street. Marcus rested his hands on the porch railing and looked toward the fence that separated the two properties. A porch light glowed softly on the other side, where Emily's back patio stretched toward a small wooden deck. For a moment he thought the yard was empty, but then the sliding glass door opened, and Emily stepped outside carrying a mug that released a faint curl of steam into the cool air. She stopped when she noticed Marcus standing on his porch. The distance between the two houses was barely 20 feet, yet the quiet space between them felt much larger. Emily hesitated briefly before speaking. "Lily told me she finished her fractions," she said, her voice calm but warm. Marcus nodded slowly. "She did," he replied. The breeze moved gently through the trees overhead, carrying the soft rustle of leaves across the quiet yards. Emily leaned lightly against the railing of her deck, her expression thoughtful. "She is very smart," she said after a moment. Marcus looked down at the wooden boards beneath his feet, his jaw tightening slightly before he answered. "She tries her best." The porch light beside him cast a soft glow across the yard, and for the first time since Emily had moved in, Marcus did not immediately retreat inside. Instead, he remained standing there, the quiet of the evening wrapping around both houses like a shared pause. Emily lifted the mug to her lips and took a small sip before glancing back toward him. "I hope you do not mind that I helped her," she said gently. Marcus finally raised his eyes toward her face, and the familiar wave of memory moved through him again like a shadow passing over water. For a second the years folded inward, and he saw the same calm eyes that had once convinced him everything would be fine. He drew a slow breath before answering. "She appreciated it," he said quietly. The words were simple, but the tone carried something deeper, something careful and guarded. Emily studied his expression for a moment, as if sensing that the distance between them had nothing to do with ordinary neighborly politeness. The night air settled again into silence while the porch lights glowed softly against the darkening sky, and Marcus Bennett stood there wondering how long a person could carry the weight of a memory before it finally demanded to be spoken aloud. The night air remained cool and still between the two houses while the porch lights cast soft circles of yellow across the wooden decks and quiet lawns. Marcus Bennett stood with both hands resting on the railing of his porch, his shoulders slightly tense as if he had been carrying the same invisible weight for years without setting it down. Across the yard, Emily Carter watched him carefully, sensing that the silence between them held more than simple neighborly distance. Somewhere down the block a car door closed and an engine started, but the sound faded quickly into the calm suburban night. Emily lowered her mug slowly and spoke with gentle curiosity. "You said yesterday that looking at me hurts," she said. "I have been trying to understand what you meant." Marcus did not answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the dark line of trees beyond the houses where the sky stretched deep and quiet above Maplewood Street. For a long moment, he simply breathed, the cool air filling his lungs while the years he had tried to bury pressed quietly against his thoughts. Finally he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You remind me of someone," he said. Emily waited, sensing that the words were only the beginning of something heavier. Marcus lifted one hand from the railing and rubbed the back of his neck slowly before continuing. About 9 years ago, I worked at a financial logistics company in Durham. It was not a big job, but it paid enough to support my family. My wife was still alive back then, and Lily was just a baby. He paused briefly, as if measuring the memory before allowing it to continue. There was a woman in the office who looked a lot like you. Same eyes. Same way of speaking calmly, even when everyone else was stressed. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression soft but attentive. Marcus stared at the ground for a moment before looking up again toward the yard between them. One afternoon she accused me of doing something I did not do, he said quietly. At first I thought it would be cleared up quickly. I believed the truth would speak for itself. The breeze moved through the maple branches overhead, carrying the faint rustle of leaves through the night air. Marcus continued slowly, his tone careful and controlled. But things did not work out that way. The company believed her story before anyone really listened to mine. Suddenly the job I depended on disappeared. The reputation I spent years building vanished in a single week. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the warm mug as she listened. Marcus did not look angry. If anything, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had already relived the moment 1,000 times in his own mind. It took years before the truth finally surfaced and cleared my name, he said. By then my marriage had fallen apart, my savings were gone, and my life looked very different from the one I thought I was building. The porch lights glowed quietly around them while the street remained still and peaceful. Marcus lifted his gaze toward Emily again, and for the first time the guarded wall in his expression softened slightly with honesty. When you moved in next door I saw your face, and it felt like the past had walked right back into my life, he said. I know you are not that person. I know you have done nothing wrong. But sometimes memory does not care about logic. Emily stood quietly on her deck, absorbing the weight of his words, while the cool night breeze moved between the houses. Marcus rested his hands once more on the railing and exhaled slowly, as if speaking the truth aloud had finally loosened a knot he had been holding inside for years. Emily Carter remained still on her deck for several seconds after Marcus finished speaking, the quiet night air settling gently between the two houses as the weight of his story lingered in the silence. The porch light above her cast a soft glow across the wooden boards beneath her feet, and the steam rising from her mug had begun to fade into the cool evening breeze. She had not expected the answer she received. In truth, she had assumed his distance came from something ordinary, perhaps a simple dislike or a misunderstanding between neighbors. But the quiet pain in Marcus Bennett's voice made it clear that what he carried was far deeper than an uncomfortable first impression. Emily placed the mug carefully on the railing beside her and folded her arms lightly, not as a barrier, but as someone absorbing a difficult truth. I am sorry that happened to you, she said softly. Marcus gave a small nod, though his eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the yard where the dark outline of the maple trees swayed gently. It was a long time ago, he replied, though the words sounded more like a statement of fact than something that had truly lost its weight. Emily stepped a little closer to the edge of her deck, the wooden boards creaking faintly under her feet. The truth eventually came out? She asked. Marcus nodded once. Yes. It took years, but eventually the company discovered the real story. They cleared my record and apologized. He gave a faint half-smile that carried little warmth. But by then life had already moved on. The quiet honesty in that sentence seemed to settle into the night like a final piece of a puzzle. Emily studied his face carefully, noticing the tired strength in the way he held himself. She had met many people during her years working in law offices across North Carolina, but there was something about Marcus that felt different. He did not speak with bitterness. Instead, he spoke with the calm acceptance of someone who had already walked through the hardest part of the storm. You built a new life, she said after a moment. Marcus glanced toward the house behind him, where the warm glow of the kitchen light shone through the window. I tried, he said quietly. Lily deserved stability. That became my focus. Emily nodded slowly, understanding the meaning behind those words more than Marcus might have expected. For several years, she had worked as a civil attorney specializing in employment law, handling cases that involved wrongful accusations and workplace disputes. She knew how easily a single misunderstanding could ripple through someone's life like a stone dropped into still water. She also knew how difficult it was for people to recover their sense of trust afterward. The breeze moved gently across the yards again, carrying the faint scent of pine and cool earth. Emily rested her hands on the railing and looked toward Marcus with quiet sincerity. "You are right about one thing," she said carefully. "Memory does not always listen to logic. But sometimes new experiences can help rewrite old ones." Marcus considered her words without speaking. His eyes moved briefly toward her face and then back toward the yard, as if measuring the distance between past and present. Emily did not push further. Instead, she gave him a small, reassuring smile and reached for her mug again. "For what it is worth," she added softly, "I am glad Lily knocked on the fence yesterday. I think she is a wonderful kid." Marcus's expression softened slightly at the mention of his daughter. "She is," he said simply. The porch lights continued to glow quietly around them while the night deepened above Maplewood Street. And for the first time since Emily Carter had moved into the blue house next door, the space between the two neighbors no longer felt like something they had to avoid, but something they were slowly beginning to understand. The night slowly settled over Maplewood Street after the conversation ended, and the quiet neighborhood returned to its familiar rhythm of distant traffic and rustling leaves beneath the tall maple trees. Marcus Bennett stood on his porch for several minutes after Emily Carter stepped back inside her house, the warm glow of her living room light fading behind the sliding glass door. The air felt cooler now, and the stillness of the street carried a calm that Marcus had not felt in a long time. He rested his hands on the wooden railing and looked across the small yard that separated the two houses, replaying the conversation quietly in his mind. For years he had avoided speaking about that chapter of his life, believing that silence was the safest way to move forward. Yet tonight something had shifted. The story was no longer locked inside his thoughts. It had been spoken aloud beneath the soft glow of porch lights and the open sky above the neighborhood. Behind him, the back door creaked gently as Lily stepped onto the porch in her pajamas, holding the same stuffed rabbit she carried every night before bed. "Dad, are you coming inside soon?" she asked sleepily. Marcus turned and smiled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing the moment he saw her. "In a minute, sweetheart," he replied. Lily walked over and leaned against his side, peering through the wooden rails toward the neighboring yard. "Miss Emily is nice," she said quietly. Marcus looked down at his daughter and nodded. "Yes," he said after a moment. "She is." Lily yawned and rested her head against his arm before heading back inside, where the soft glow of the kitchen light waited. Marcus remained on the porch a little longer, watching the stars slowly appear above the dark outline of the trees. The quiet street felt different tonight, not because the past had disappeared, but because the weight of it no longer felt quite as heavy as it once had. Across the fence, Emily's porch lights switched off, leaving only the gentle illumination of the street lamp at the corner. The world seemed to pause in that calm moment between night and tomorrow. Marcus finally stepped back into the house and closed the door softly behind him. The warmth of the kitchen welcomed him again, and the familiar sounds of the refrigerator humming and Lily brushing her teeth down the hallway filled the small home with ordinary life. Later that night, after Lily was asleep, Marcus stood at the window for a moment and looked toward the quiet yard next door. For the first time since the blue house had been occupied, he did not feel the need to turn away. Instead, he simply stood there in silence, breathing in the calm night air drifting through the slightly open window. Outside, the maple leaves moved gently in the breeze, and the neighborhood remained peaceful beneath the soft glow of distant streetlights. Some memories would always remain part of his story, but Marcus Bennett understood now that they did not have to define the chapters that came next. Somewhere beyond the quiet fence line, a new beginning had already taken its first small step, and for the first time in many years, Marcus allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might carry something lighter than yesterday.